now let's look at the menstrual cycle. If we're talking about the standard average 28 day, from day 1 is the day you menstruate. So day 1 is the day your period begins. Now I did a lot of phone triage work as a nurse where there was an awful lot, and I worked weekends, where there was a lot of judgment lapses on Friday night, Saturday night, and then there were calls to the nurse line on Saturday morning, Sunday morning about how costly the lapse in judgment was going to prove to be. So the case was, is it possible that I could have gotten pregnant? And you have to know that the day the period begins, well, they always want to tell you how long the period lasted. That's irrelevant. The day the period begins, all right, from day 1 to day 14 is called the follicular phase. We are maturing a follicle. From ovulation till when period begins, so that's around day 14 to day 28, that's called the luteal phase because that's when the corpus luteum is actively putting out progesterone. Okay, notice the activity of the hormones, notice these words. So FSH and estrogen put in more FSH receptors. So the follicle will become increasingly sensitive to the levels of FSH coming from the anterior pituitary. That's called upregulation. FSH and estrogen are putting receptors to luteinizing hormone in the Graafian follicle, and that's called permissive effect. So again, that was part of the online lectures at the beginning of chapter 11. Rapidly rising estrogen causes increased amounts of LH and FSH. The increase in LH causes that egg to pop out. So looking at those hormones, there's estrogen. Now remember, the Graafian follicle is swelling. As it swells, more estrogen is being put out. The more estrogen being put out, now we have positive feedback. The more estrogen being put out, the more LH and FSH are being put out. When LH peaks, the egg pops out 16 hours later. Notice all this stuff falls after that ovulation. But then progesterone rises out of the corpus luteum. Progesterone is coming from that corpus luteum. Okay, I showed you that already. There's the egg popping out, making its way into the uterine tube. I still call them fallopian tubes, but you know, I'm old. Into the uterine tube. And then, if fertilized, we go on, we'll talk about that in just a little bit. The egg will degenerate in just a couple of days if it's not fertilized. And then here's the actual corpus luteum, that's what it looks like, and it puts out progesterone. And I want to get to this picture. I like this picture because it's got it all, and I like figures. All right, there's day 1. Day 1 is when the period begins. The lining of the uterus sheds. Okay, lining of the uterus sheds, gonadotropin-releasing hormones being produced. We start putting out FSH and LH together. They cause the follicle to begin to get bigger. As the follicle grows, it stretches the ovary. Stretching the ovary causes more estrogen to be produced from the ovarian cells. Now we're going to have the positive feedback. Estrogen is increasing, which is increasing the thickness of the uterine lining, and it increases gonadotropin-releasing hormone. So here we have positive feedback, which will now increase LH-FSH. When LH peaks, 16 hours later, the egg pops out. Now then notice estrogen does a little dip. Of course, FSH and LH dip. Then the corpus luteum puts out progesterone. Progesterone keeps the uterine lining nice and plump and thick while we wait to see, is that egg fertilized? So we need a nice thick lining for the little new embryo. Of course, it's not an embryo yet, it's still called a zygote, when it gets to the uterus so that it can embed in the uterine wall. So that's what the corpus luteum is doing, that's what progesterone is doing, and this is when you have your premenstrual symptoms. I had heck of PMS. So salt cravings, chocolate cravings, I would alternate salt and chocolate. So it would be potato chips and chocolate cake. Then it would be popcorn and chocolate candy. Then it would be fat. Is it any wonder I'm fat? And then water retention, crankiness, face breakout, unusual sensitivity to smell, clumsy, mood changes. I got to the point I wouldn't make any decisions during PMS because these are not normal decisions. These are progesterone-induced decisions, and those are not wise. So I would wait a few days. And then right before my period began, I would have what I call the moody blues, burst into tears at cat commercials on TV. Okay. You know, it's like, why am I crying? And I think, oh yeah, my period's supposed to start tomorrow. So tomorrow it'll be over. Okay. Okay, there you go. For those of you who do not know what PMS is like. Terrible. All right. Progesterone decreases, and it is the drop in progesterone that causes the uterine lining to shed. Drop in progesterone makes the uterine lining shed and empty the uterus. All right, if you are on the standard birth control pills, that's 21 days of active product and then 7 days of inactive, it's when the progesterone level drops is when your uterine lining sheds. So again, progesterone level drops, that makes uterine lining shed. There, if you like it in feedback form, there you go. Notice there's positive feedback. Okay. All right, what is contraception? Contraception takes advantage of negative feedback. So, let me go back right here. This progesterone estrogen is negative feedback against the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, so that FSH and LH will not be released during the time that progesterone estrogen is high. We do not want another egg while we're waiting to see, is this egg fertile? Is this egg going to be a baby? That's how hormonal contraception works. It provides negative feedback against the anterior pituitary. When they first came up with birth control pills, they thought that you had to take high doses of progesterone estrogen in the 1960s when it came out. And those women had lots of side effects, weight gain, and then blood clots and stroke. And then they figured out that it just takes a little. And so now you are on, if you're taking them, low dose estrogen progesterone, which is why you cannot skip a single pill. If you skip a pill, that your estrogen progesterone levels will drop enough that negative feedback will be released, and you'll go ahead and start maturing another egg. And then that's why you would get pregnant if you miss a pill, or certainly 2 pills. All right, there's the egg, bombarded with sperm. The lucky sperm has enzymes on the head that digest the outer wrapping of the egg. It's called the zona pellucida, clear zone. The head penetrates the egg, the tail with the mitochondrial DNA is left behind, and there is a wave of calcium that goes across the surface of the ovum so that only one sperm got in. If we do polysperm, it's going to die because we can only have 2 sets of chromosomes, one from mom, one from dad. All right, now we need to talk about this part. All right, fertilization occurs in the uterine tube, so the sperm need to be waiting. The egg is popped out, joins with the sperm. All right, now we have something called a zygote, and this is called a zygote until it makes it into the uterine lining. When it implants in the uterine lining, then it's called an embryo. All of this, according to medical terminology, this is not pregnant. You're not pregnant till that zygote embeds in the uterus. Then it's considered pregnancy. This is considered embryo. Now let's talk about then what medical science says about different contraception methods. So anything that keeps that zygote from implanting is not an abortion. If we're talking about IUD, for example, anything that keeps the zygote from implanting is not considered a therapeutic abortion. So let's talk about the terms abortion. We have spontaneous abortion. This is called a miscarriage. Make sure your clientele understand you did not just accuse them of having an abortion. It's just we call it spontaneous abortion. A therapeutic abortion is an intentional abortion. Okay, so that would be abortion. how our society terms that. Anything that causes the zygote to not implant is not considered an abortion, therapeutic abortion, as far as medical science is concerned. But depends on your religious beliefs. Do you think that is a human being? If you think that is a human being, then anything that keeps that from implanting is an abortion. So things that would keep it from implanting, I can't remember if I put that slide in here, let me see if I did or not. I hope I did not. The IUD, intrauterine device, sits right here. It's a little wire thing. It sits here in the uterus, and it does two things. One, it's putting out hormones, which will decrease the ability of the zygote to implant, and it keeps this uterine lining kind of irritated so that nothing can implant. But there could be contraception, or there could be conception, there could be egg and sperm joining, it just cannot implant. So there are some faiths that would find an IUD reprehensible. Now let's talk about the morning after pill. The morning after pill is a great big dose of progesterone. Progesterone. All right, if you give a big dose of progesterone before ovulation, it prevents ovulation from occurring. If you give that big dose of progesterone after ovulation has occurred, now remember, it's the drop in progesterone that causes the uterine lining to shed. So the big dose of progesterone, and then it drops off, and the uterine lining will shed. If during that time a zygote is making its way to the uterus, then it will be flushed along with the uterine lining. And so that would only be considered a therapeutic abortion if the woman took it after ovulation, and then it would cause, and if conception had occurred, then that could be considered a therapeutic abortion. So just making sure you understand what's going on with all these different contraceptions, because there's a lot of controversy involved with contraception.
What about the bar? The insulin?
That's going to be, oops, that, negative feedback. So you don't even produce an egg. So as long as you're not producing an egg, well, that's not going to be a therapeutic abortion. Okay, questions about that? So that's a lot to take in, but to help you understand what you're advising your clientele. All right, well, let's go to the lab. There's a little bit more to talk about. Not much more, just a little bit more to talk about, and then we've got our lab activity. A little bit about pregnancy and prolactin.
Oh, thank God. Damn. I'm starting to think my phone was gonna run.